Welcome back to another episode of Fortress Feed, where we dive deep into the intersections of technology, privacy, and security. Today, I want to take a moment to talk about something that I genuinely love, but also think deserves a more nuanced look: open source software. Tools like Signal, ProtonMail, and countless others are proof of what the open source community can accomplish, and they exemplify the spirit of transparency and collaboration that makes this movement so powerful. But as much as I love it, it's important for us to step back and acknowledge the realities and limitations of open source. Not to disparage it, but to appreciate it for what it truly is, warts and all. Let's kick things off with a classic argument you've probably heard if you've spent any time in the open source world: the many eyes principle. It's the idea that if the source code is available for anyone to review, then vulnerabilities are more likely to be found and fixed. With enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, right? It sounds great, and often it works well. But this argument is a lot like the nothing to hide fallacy in privacy debates. Just because something is theoretically reviewable doesn't mean it is being actively reviewed. And even if it is, it doesn't mean that all reviewers are equally skilled or motivated. Let's be honest here. Many open source projects are maintained by just one or two developers. These individuals are often highly dedicated, but they're human, and there's only so much one or two people can do. Remember OpenSSL? This piece of software was, and still is, foundational to much of the internet's security infrastructure. But in 2014, Heartbleed, a serious vulnerability, went undetected for years. This was despite OpenSSL being open source and theoretically having plenty of eyes on it. It wasn't until disaster struck that the world realized just how under-resourced the project really was. And that's not an isolated incident. It's a reminder that available for review doesn't always mean adequately reviewed. And here's another wrinkle in the conversation. Even if the code is reviewed and deemed secure, how do we know that's the version we're running? Let's say you download an open source app. How can you be sure that the binary served to your phone or browser corresponds to the reviewed code? Sure, you could inspect network traffic with tools like Wireshark or build the app from source yourself, but how many people actually do that? How many even could, given the technical expertise required? And while gatekeepers like Apple's App Store or Google's Play Store do some vetting, let's not kid ourselves. They aren't foolproof. The concept of ensuring that what you see in the code is what you get in the final product is called reproducible builds. It's an important movement that aims to allow anyone to independently verify that a given piece of software was built from the same source code they can examine. While promising, it's still not universally adopted, and even where it is, it often requires a significant degree of technical know-how that most users simply don't possess. And that's the reality we need to consider. While open source software offers the promise of transparency, in practice, ensuring that transparency often demands more effort and expertise than most people have to offer. Now, let's dive into an area where open source really has some catching up to do: endpoint security. I'm sure you've heard of ClamAve, an open source antivirus tool. It's pretty solid when it comes to scanning files for known threats, but here's the thing: it primarily excels at finding malware in files at rest. The threats we face today are far more sophisticated. We're talking about zero-day exploits, ransomware, and phishing attacks that target users as much as systems. What open-source solution adequately handles these threats? ClamAve doesn't provide the kind of proactive defense you'd get with a proprietary tool like Sophos Intercept X, which uses machine learning and behavioral analysis to stop threats in their tracks. Modern endpoint protection is about more than just scanning for known threats. It involves real-time behavioral analysis, machine learning to predict malicious activity, and heuristic approaches to catch new, unknown threats before they can do damage. Unfortunately, creating and maintaining this kind of advanced, proactive defense requires significant resources that are often only available to large, well-funded companies. That's not to say that open source can't innovate or that it lacks talented contributors, but rather that the scope of what's required in modern endpoint protection often exceeds what a decentralized, volunteer-driven effort can provide. And this isn't just true for antivirus. It extends to the broader cybersecurity landscape. Yes, Sophos is closed source, and yes, there are privacy trade-offs, but sometimes the best defense isn't the most transparent one. Security, unfortunately, sometimes needs to trump openness, and that's a reality we need to accept. Proprietary software often benefits from economies of scale that allow for rapid development, extensive testing, and integration of cutting-edge technology, features that simply aren't practical for many open-source projects, especially those relying on small teams of volunteers. And speaking of security versus openness, let's talk about the mobile world. Apple's infamous walled garden is about as far from open source as it gets. Everything is locked down, tightly controlled, and deeply proprietary. But here's the catch. It works. Apple's strict app vetting process and consistent security updates mean that iPhones are significantly less prone to malware compared to more open platforms. Tools like Intercept X for mobile also come with privacy trade-offs, but they offer phishing protection that's leagues ahead of any open source equivalent. This isn't because the open source community lacks talent, it's because big tech companies simply have more resources. Let's be clear, the walled garden approach isn't perfect. It comes at a cost to privacy, flexibility, and control. Users are restricted to Apple's ecosystem, and the company decides which apps get to play by their rules. For many of us, that trade-off feels limiting, even stifling. But the reality is that for the average user, someone who just wants a device that works securely without having to tinker, the trade-offs make sense. Apple's approach has been effective in creating a secure environment, and that's something we can't dismiss out of hand. On the other hand, there are alternative mobile operating systems like Graphene OS or Calyx OS, which are built on open-source foundations and prioritize both privacy and security. These systems are fantastic for those who are technically inclined and willing to sacrifice some convenience for greater control. But let's be honest, the barrier to entry is high. Not everyone wants to, or even knows how to, install a custom ROM on their phone. This brings us back to the central theme. The best solution isn't necessarily the most open or the most closed. It's the one that strikes the right balance for the user's needs and abilities. We need to be honest about the trade-offs here. Open source is wonderful for privacy, control, and transparency. If you use Signal, you can be confident that the encryption is exactly what it claims to be because experts have reviewed it. But open source doesn't always mean more secure, and it isn't always the best tool for every job. Sometimes proprietary solutions, despite their less appealing black box nature, bring critical value, especially when we're talking about sophisticated threat detection and response. Let's talk about another example, password management. Open source tools like Bitwarden offer transparency and community trust. You can even host your own Bitwarden server if you want full control. But there are also proprietary options like 1Password, which offers features like travel mode, allowing users to strip sensitive data from their devices while traveling, and has a polished user experience that's hard to beat. Again, this is about the trade-off between openness and added value. Bitwarden is fantastic for those who prioritize open source, but for users who need specific features or usability, 1Password might be the better choice, despite being closed source. There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer here. Privacy and security are about balance, and we need to pick the right tool for the right job. For messaging, Signal's open-source encryption is tough to beat. For endpoint protection, Sophos might be the better choice, despite its closed nature. And that's okay. The key is not to blindly worship at the altar of open source or closed source, but to understand what each has to offer and make informed decisions based on strengths and weaknesses. We need to recognize that security is complex and multifaceted, and often it involves making pragmatic choices rather than ideological ones. So there you have it. Open source is an incredible force for good, but it's not magic. It requires more than just transparency. It requires active, ongoing vigilance. And sometimes, to truly stay secure, we need to embrace a little opacity, however begrudgingly. Thanks for tuning in today to Fortress Feed. If you found this episode insightful, make sure to subscribe and share it with your friends. Let's keep this conversation going, and until next time, stay vigilant and stay secure.